Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience, and we're ready to get started. So, Excellencies, distinguished guests, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for attending today's event titled Ecocide, Voices of the Victims. My name is Ashika Singh. I'm a counsel in the International Dispute Resolution Group at Debevoise and Plimpton here in New York. I will be moderating this discussion, which is co-hosted by the permanent missions of Vanuatu and Samoa to the United Nations. So before we dive in, I'd just like to take a few minutes to set the stage and introduce our panel of very distinguished speakers. Today, we are going to examine the topic of ecocide, efforts towards its criminalization under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and how the crime of ecocide has impacted victims in different contexts where mass environmental damage is suffered. So to start, what is ecocide? Well, in 2021, an independent expert panel proposed the following definition, which I'm going to quote because the precise terminology is very important. Quote, unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts, end quote. The proposed definition fills an important gap that currently exists in the international legal framework to strengthen environmental protections and extend criminal liability for violations during both armed conflict as well as during times of peace, which is actually when most severe environmental damage occurs. Today's discussion is both necessary and timely. Ukraine recently announced that it is gathering evidence as part of a, quote, ecocide case against Russia before the ICC on the basis of the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. The European Union also very recently agreed to implement a directive to criminalize additional acts that cause environmental harm and heighten sanctions for the worst offenders, including those, quote, comparable to ecocide. And states are moving to criminalize ecocide or comparable provisions in domestic criminal legislation as well. So in our discussion, we will take an in-depth look at this proposed definition of ecocide and its application to instances of mass environmental damage worldwide. This type of severe environmental damage is felt particularly deeply by small island states, states engaged in armed conflict, indigenous territories, and across the world's oceans. In each of these instances, vulnerable populations bear the disproportionate brunt of the consequences of ecocide. Their voices are critical in this conversation, and we are privileged today to have with us speakers who are able to address each of these diverse scenarios. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to introducing this distinguished panel. First, His Excellency Ambassador Odo Tevi is the permanent representative of the Republic of Vanuatu to the United Nations. Ambassador Tevi has chaired the Special Committee on the UN Charter and Strengthening the Organization and the UN Asia-Pacific Group. Prior to his appointment as ambassador, Ambassador Tevi worked as an international consultant for several projects, including for the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. Next to my right, we have Jojo Mehta, who is the co-founder and CEO of Stop Ecocide International, a non-governmental organization dedicated to making ecocide an international crime. Ms. Mehta is also the chair of the Stop Ecocide Foundation and convener of the independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide. Next, Valdelice Veron, who unfortunately could not be here today in person, but has pre-recorded her remarks, is a leader and spokeswoman of the Guarani-Kaiowá people in Brazil. Ms. Veron is an anthropologist and indigenous rights activist dedicated to the conservation of nature and the protection of indigenous territories. Here with us, we do have Dmytro Koval, who is an associate professor at the National University of Kyiv Molia Academy and legal director of the Truth Hounds, an organization that documents and investigates international war crimes and other serious human rights violations committed during the conflict in Ukraine and surrounding regions. Next, Captain Alex Cornellissen, who is joining us remotely, is the CEO of the Netherlands-based Sea Shepherd Global, a worldwide movement that coordinates independent national and regional entities in over 20 countries to cooperate on direct action marine conservation campaigns. Captain Cornellissen has been involved in Sea Shepherd since 2002. Next, Maureen Penjueli, who is also not here but is joining us remotely, is the coordinator for the Fiji-based Pacific Network on Globalization, an NGO that promotes the rights of self-determination for Pacific Island peoples. Ms. Penjueli has worked in the not-for-profit sector for 30 years, focusing on the Pacific region, and her approach focuses on the interactions between science and policy and how they implicate the rights of indigenous peoples. Last but certainly not least, at the end of the table is Rodrigo Lledó, who is the Americas Director of Stop Ecocide International. Mr. Jojo is a human rights lawyer and was a member of the independent expert panel that drafted the proposed legal definition for ecocide published in June of 2021. Previously, Mr. Jojo was head of the legal department of the Human Rights Program of the Ministry of the Interior of Chile. So I'm now very pleased to turn to Ambassador Tevi for his opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here to introduce today's discussion on the effects of ecocide taking place around the world. The effects of climate change, as well as ecocidal conduct more generally, are heightened for small island developing states, where geographical vulnerabilities mean that ensuring climate and environmental justice is not only a future problem, but one of the present. The impact on small island developing states is particularly acute due to our exposure to extreme weather events, such as tropical cyclones and slow onset events, such as sea level rise, and the ensuing socioeconomic consequences, including population displacement and potentially the loss of territory. However, the impacts of climate change are not limited to seas, and as we have seen this past year, the whole world is vulnerable. With particular regard to the UNGA resolution on the right to a healthy environment, the close relationship between the environmental protection and the upholding of human rights has never been clearer. Vanuatu is committed to the effective protection of human rights and environmental justice in ensuring climate justice, particularly for small island developing states that are highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. It is essential to have enforceable legal tools. This is one of the many reasons that Vanuatu, together with a group of co-countries, has been leading efforts that secured a request for an advisory opinion from the ICJ on the responsibilities of states around climate change. Given the profound ramifications of climate change on every aspect of human life, the work of the General Assembly in the area of climate change would greatly benefit from authoritative advice on the legal implications of climate change encompassing the UNFFC and its related agreements, as well as, more generally, a wider body of norms from both treaty and customary international law relevant to climate change. It is important, however, not only to clarify obligations under existing law, but to ensure that the right deterrents are put in place to steer decision-making in a healthier direction. It is important for policymakers and industry leaders to be conscious of the necessary constraints to underpin a safe future for citizens of all nations. Criminal law has been an important role to play here. Vanuatu is also taking firm action in this area, which brings us to today's topic. We were the first state to make a public declaration in favor of ecocide law at the Assembly of States Parties to the International Criminal Court in December of 2019. Vanuatu considers ecocide law as an essential component in the fight for climate justice and is proud to be taking a lead role in international efforts for Rome Statute amendment. Today's panel discussion intends to increase attention to the wide applicability of an ecocide crime and thus its relevance to different areas where mass environmental damage is suffered, small island states, states suffering armed conflict, indigenous territories, and the ocean. It is essential that legal measures for environmental protection can account for different contexts and actors, and Ecocide law holds a great promise in this context. The world is at a crossroad, and we as world leaders have an obligation to take action that preserves and protects the planet for future generations. Climate and environmental protection is critical not only to seeds, but all nations. International justice is foundational to advancing this conversation, and I look forward to learning more from the distinguished panel on how recognition of Ecocide has particular relevance in many different contexts. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Tevi, for those powerful remarks. Before we delve even further into the impact of Ecocide from the perspective of the victims, let's take a step back to understand the current state of the Stop Ecocide initiative. So Jojo, I'd like to turn to you on that. The movement to criminalize ecocide under the Rome Statute has grown tremendously over the past several years. I'm hoping you could start by giving us an idea of why this movement is so important, where it is today. Has there been political buy-in, for example, on a domestic, regional, global level, from whom? And finally, what are the main challenges the initiative has faced, and what do you believe are necessary steps to address those challenges?
Thank you so much. Excellencies, distinguished guests and colleagues, it's an honor to be with you today. Why is it important to recognize a crime of ecocide, and why, in particular, under international criminal law? After all, we have many environmental laws in place around the world. Do we really need an international crime as well? The voices you will be hearing in this event will, I believe, be making it clear from a number of perspectives that we do, as existing legal provision is proving inadequate to deter, prevent, and sanction the most severe harms. In part, this is due to the specificity, fragmented nature, and variability between jurisdictions of this existing legal provision, leading to weak and piecemeal enforcement. However, this in turn points to a more profound underlying problem. We simply do not take environmental destruction seriously enough. The Rome Statute was created to address the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole, harms that threaten the peace, security, and well-being of the world. And the existing international crimes, understandably, center on human harm in this context. However, we are now, rather late in the day, beginning to understand that our ability to survive and thrive on our planetary home, both in particular geographies and political contexts, and as a species, depends entirely upon thriving ecosystems, which provide healthy food, breathable air, and drinkable water, and which, importantly, also regulate climate. Acts that severely disrupt or destroy these natural systems, acts that constitute ecocide, therefore actually do, as we are learning, constitute serious threats to the peace, security, and well-being of the world. Indeed, a recent report from legal advisory NGO Climate Council, submitted to the Office of the Prosecutor, sets out clearly how global warming magnifies the risks that lead to violent conflict, including in situations already under investigation at the ICC. Another important aspect of Rome Statute crimes is the focus on natural persons, and in particular, persons in positions of superior responsibility. In the context of ecocide, this is key. Unlike breaches of regulation, the commission of serious crimes has a strong moral stigma attached to it. A board of directors is likely to approach its environmental obligations very differently, knowing that if it fails to fulfill them and commits ecocide as a result, its individual members could potentially be held criminally responsible. A crime of ecocide in this context provides a double level of deterrence. Not only would personal freedom and reputation be at stake, but also the reputation and, crucially, the stock value of the company in question. Recognition of ecocide as an international crime will therefore encourage a foundational cultural understanding that severe environmental harms in peacetime are bad, dangerous, and to be avoided, rather than balanced against profits, and that in times of conflict, such harms constitute more than just incidental collateral damage and should be given due weight in and of themselves. The legal initiative to criminalize ecocide is already gaining rapid momentum around the world, and defining ecocide as an international crime has proved to be a key milestone. The 2021 definition, mentioned by the moderator and proposed by the independent expert panel convened by our foundation and led by Philippe Sands, KC, and Jojo, has catalyzed political discussion and proposals of law around the world, with several announced, tabled, or progressed in different national parliaments already this year: Belgium, Brazil, Italy, Mexico, the Netherlands, Scotland, Spain, Catalonia, Turkey, and the UK. In a highly significant development just last month, the European Parliament, Commission, and Council reached political agreement to include environmental offences comparable to ecocide into the revised EU Environmental Crimes Directive, meaning that 27 countries must now harmonise with this over the next 2 years in their own penal codes. The Council of Europe is also discussing inclusion of ecocide into a new convention on protection of the environment through criminal law. So it is clear that there is a strong legislative direction of travel emerging, and these major European developments will undoubtedly encourage next steps here at the ICC as well, where the conversation on ecocide has been growing steadily ever since Vanuatu's call for its consideration at the ASP in 2019. The main challenges we have observed in the evolution of this conversation globally are cultural ones. There can be an initial tendency to perceive criminal law as extreme or a scary measure to take. Within the ICC context, however, this is not so much an issue, as there is a fundamental understanding of criminal law as preventive and protective, and of international criminal law as providing a strong moral imperative and corresponding moral stigma. Secondly, because ecocide does not, particularly in peacetime contexts, have the same direct evil intent that, say, genocide has, it is essentially a crime of recklessness. There can be a reluctance to perceive it as a serious criminal offence, despite the obvious severity of the consequences. This is best countered with up-to-date scientific information, data gathering, and on-the-ground reporting of experience, as we shall see shortly from today's panellists. Thirdly, there are technical challenges to the bringing together of environmental law, which contains few outright prohibitions, and criminal law, which seeks a high degree of certainty. In itself, this reflects a cultural issue at the heart of our current global predicament, which is that we are only just beginning to perceive that the upsetting of ecological balance is actually a clear and present danger to humanity. We lack the understanding of interconnectivity of natural and societal systems. In this matter, the independent expert panel definition provides a useful starting point, and the discussion will be an important one. It is most encouraging to see the growing engagement of states parties in the conversation around ecocide as a fifth Rome Statute crime. Our foundation continues to be available to support in an advisory capacity, and we look forward to upcoming developments. In conclusion, I would just like to acknowledge the HR 75 events going on today and tomorrow, commemorating 75 years since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because, as I hope today's event will illustrate, ecocide is a highly significant human rights issue. The UN High Commissioner Volker Turk has spoken out clearly in favour of ecocide as an international crime, and in the opening panel in Geneva this very morning, Professor Philippe Sands, KC, included recognition of a crime of ecocide as a key recommendation in the human rights context. As Professor Sands has said on more than one occasion, it is no longer a matter of if, merely of when this recognition will happen, and for the sake of all our futures, it cannot come too soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jojo, for providing that frame of reference. As we turn our focus now to the impacts of ecocide, this panel is about raising up the voices of victims. And to start, I'd like to turn to Ms. Veron from Brazil. Unfortunately, as I said, she could not be here with us today, but she has pre-recorded some remarks on video highlighting the impact on indigenous communities in Brazil of the destruction of their lands.
Meu nome é Valdelice Veron, sou estado de Mato Grosso do Sul. Estou representando o meu povo Guarani-Kaiowá, da Tiguaçu, que é a grande Assembleia dos Povos Indígenas Guarani-Kaiowá. E estou vindo aqui na COP28 e juntamente com várias pessoas e povos que lutam pela vida no planeta Terra, lutando contra o ecocídio, porque o ecocídio, quando se é praticado não só para uma ou duas pessoas, mas é contra o planeta. E se é contra o planeta, é contra a humanidade. E o ecocídio, para nós, é a morte da nossa casa, porque nós moramos, nós fazemos parte dessa floresta que muitas vezes é destruída, junto com a gente, junto com os nossos animais, com todos os guardiãos, os remédios, todos os tipos de vida que há é destruído. E também somos destruídos junto, somos mortos junto. Por isso que nós estamos lutando quando se fala ecocídio, quando se fala genocídio. Nós estamos falando de seres humanos. Quando passam a correntão, quando os latifundiários passam aquele correntão que eu falo para derrubar toda a mata de uma vez, passam com o trator de um lado e outro e aquela corrente aqui para derrubar, são mortes de vários seres ali dentro. Não é só árvores sagradas, nós temos árvores sagradas que nós temos tirado ali a casca, a raiz, o fruto, mas também a morte de todos os seres, de todos os animais ali que vivem essa correntão. E temos várias denúncias, só que nós não somos ouvidos. Nós estamos sendo mortos junto com ele. Quando acabam passam essa correntão, depois eles queimam e depois eles arrancam a raiz e depois eles colocam ali a soja em nome do progresso. Em nome do progresso, estão matando a humanidade. Isso é um ecocídio. Em nome do progresso, quando constrói usinas, grandes usinas, em nome do progresso, os latifundiários estão acabando com o nosso rio. Porque onde nós vamos pegar as frutas, onde nós vamos pegar nossos remédios, que são conhecimentos milenares que nós temos, quando jogam o esgoto em nossos rios, isso não é progresso. Quando jogam esgoto nos rios que nós banhamos, nos rios que nós bebemos a água, nos rios que nós pescamos para comer, isso é genocídio, isso é ecocídio. Isso é um crime humanitário. É por isso que nós estamos lutando, é contra isso que nós estamos lutando. E estou vindo aqui hoje para falar para todos que estão me vendo, me ouvindo, que o crime contra a humanitária, o ecocídio tem que parar. E para isso, é você, é nós que temos que lutar para parar. Nós que temos que levantar. Se eu cair, você tem que continuar. Se você cair, nossos filhos e filhas têm que continuar. Mas temos que lutar, porque não podemos deixar que o nosso planeta Terra seja destruído. Isso é ecocídio, por isso eu falo que é a morte da nossa casa. É a morte de todas as vidas na Terra. É um crime humanitário. Quero dizer a vocês que quem que faz essa destruição Quem que está por trás dessa destruição? São grandes empresas, principalmente internacionais, que estão por trás disso. Que vêm, principalmente aqui no estado de Mato Grosso do Sul, e em todo o lugar está a marca dessas grandes empresas multinacionais que lutam para a destruição, pela ganância, pela ambição, onde não olham para a humanidade, onde não olham para as crianças, onde não tem preocupação nenhuma com o povo, com os seres humanos, muito menos com as nossas vidas na terra, na floresta, nos rios. Essas grandes empresas pisam, sufocam o nosso modo de ser. Eu venho dizer para vocês hoje que sinto por não poder estar com vocês, sinto por não poder estar com vocês aqui do estado de Mato Grosso do Sul. Porque também nós estamos passando por um momento muito difícil. Uma luta incessante, uma luta intensa pela vida, onde toda noite, todos os dias, na luz do dia, nós somos atacados. Nossas aldeias são queimadas, nossas casas sagradas queimadas. Nós levamos 6, 8 meses para construir nossas casas e eles vêm e queimam em nome do progresso. Então eu sinto por não poder estar com vocês, mas essa é a minha mensagem que estou trazendo para vocês. Vamos juntos lutar contra esse crime humanitário que é o ecocídio.
It's a very powerful statement. And I think it speaks to the importance of criminalizing ecocide in peacetime as well as during war. A key feature, of course, of the independent expert panel's proposed definition of ecocide is that it would apply in peacetime as well as in armed conflict. So I'd like to turn now from peacetime to the context of armed conflict to Dmytro to talk about ecocide in the context of the armed conflict in Ukraine. As mentioned, Ukraine just announced its intention to launch a war crimes case against Russia before the ICC on the basis of the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, which would seem to meet the elements of the proposed crime of ecocide. This is currently in the evidence-gathering stage, which is at the heart of the work that Hounds does. So, Dmytro, could you tell us a bit more about the challenges of collecting and documenting evidence of severe environmental damage as a war crime? And if there were a new distinct crime of ecocide under the Rome Statute, would that alleviate or change some of these challenges?
Sure. Thank you very much for passing me the floor. It's, of course, hard to speak after such a powerful and emotional intervention of my colleague, Ms. Veron, especially because I will, at least in part of my presentation, refer to emotionless law, but I will try to do my best to indeed show how law applies to armed conflict, to the crimes against environment right now, and how ecocide may create a better framework to respond to the damage to the environment that we see during the conflict. So if you see the presentation already, that's the research that two organizations that I represent here, Hounds and Project Expert Justice, are doing right now. After the explosion on the Kakhovka Dam that happened on June 6, 2023, we started to collect evidence from survivors, from those who see on their own eyes what were the consequences of the flooding. But also we started to process the data coming from scientists that were the first responders to the catastrophe. Apart from that, we are doing the legal classification, the legal analysis of the facts and the law. And by this, we try to help Ukrainian prosecutorial authorities, but also International Criminal Court in their efforts to bring justice to the survivors of this environmental crime. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I will start with just in a couple of slides telling you about the consequences that we are seeing now. The first slide represents probably the consequence that we consider the most widespread, long-term and severe, and that the impact of the explosion on the dam on the water resources of Ukraine. Dam was not only the installation that connected two banks of the river Dmytro or the place where the hydroelectric power plant was built. It also the installation that separated Kakhovka reservoir from the Dnipro river. And that Kakhovka reservoir was the biggest freshwater reservoir in Ukraine. So with this, the disappearance of this reservoir, we witness now domino effect, which caused the loss of groundwater resources around Kakhovka. Just to give you a picture, illustration of how it matters for Ukraine, the water that Ukraine have already lost irreversibly in Kakhovka around it amounts to 1/4 of Ukraine's entire water supply system, 1/4. According to the calculations made by our hydrogeologist, even if hypothetically we restore the dam right now, we will need 33.5 years to recover the former levels of water, including groundwater resources in the area. Next slide, please. Of course, that's understandable that the flooding and the disappearance of the reservoir impacts biodiversity in the region. It impacts both aquatic animal and terrestrial animal, vertebrate animals and invertebrate animals. This slide represents just one loss or one type of animals that were impacted by the flooding, and those are birds. You see that according to existing calculations, some of the colonies were their nests were destroyed, and for those reasons, colonies had to either use or look for other place to nest, or were completely devastated. And for some colonies, the calculations say we will need 3 to 7 years for the birds to restore their populations, pre-explosion populations. For others, even more so, 5 to 10 years. So again, very important, very severe effect of the explosion on the dam. We can move to the next slide. That's maybe less known and predictable effect of the explosion on the Kakhovka dam that has to do with nuclear safety and the spreading of radionuclides that were buried in the sediment layers of Kakhovka reservoir. So Chernobyl nuclear accident that all of you, of course, heard about and know about, caused the deposition of some radionuclides along the Dnipro River, including in Kakhovka reservoir. Not only Kakhovka nuclear accident, but also the industry activity around Dnipro, they also contributed to this deposition of radionuclides in Kakhovka reservoir bed. So after Kakhovka explosion, these sediments were flushed out, they were resuspended and carried downstream, which caused the redeposition of the radionuclides in the estuarine marshes. Those radionuclides stay now open to natural forces like water and wind and may travel even further. By this, they will, of course, contaminate the surrounding neighborhoods and areas. This also give the beginning to the process called biomagnification process, which basically is about the absorption of radionuclides by plants and further concentration in higher proportions of these radionuclides in the animals and other species when the radionuclides travel up the food chain. Maybe we can go to the next slide. So turning to the legal part of my presentation, how international law right now protects environment from these types of accidents. First of all, additional protocol 1, we are speaking here about international humanitarian law, prohibits the attacks against dams, dikes, and nuclear power plants. Even if these installations that contain dangerous forces are used in military purposes, so if, for instance, party to the conflict position some military equipment on those installations, these installations are still protected by international humanitarian law by the principle of proportionality, that basically says that even if the object is used for military purposes, still the other party to the conflict that wants to attack that object should take into consideration the potential damage that may be caused to the environment, civilian objects, but that for sure includes environment. We can go to the next slide. This IHL framework has its continuation in the international criminal law, in the Rome Statute in particular. We can use different provisions of the Rome Statute to criminalize or to classify the attacks on the environment, but there is only one provision that basically speaks about environment, mentions environment, and that the intentional launching of an attack that causes excessive, widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment in relation to the military advantage anticipated. So that's the only crime. Since it's the only crime in our investigation, we wanted to concentrate on it and try to show that in our case, indeed, environment suffered so much that we can speak about this type of war crime. We can go to the next slide, which represents some challenges that we inevitably faced during our legal research that we were doing. So the first group of challenges, I would say, has to do with the definition of the attack. There are different versions of how attack should be interpreted in international criminal law, and according to some commentators, attack should not include the putting the explosives to the object and then exploding this object. So according to some interpretation, that's not covered by the definition of attack. The next problem that we face when we try to apply this only provision of the Rome Statute to the attacks like the one that happened in Kaiowá is the debate regarding the attacks within the control areas. So some say that if the attack happens on the controlled territory, territory controlled by the party, then this can't be again classified as an attack. It should rather be classified as a damage to civilian objects, which does not include, of course, the environmental layer or environmental dimension to the in the deliberations. So those are the challenges on the attack side. And on the next slide, there are also challenges on the side of the effects of the impact of the attack. Rome Statute now requires the effects to be cumulative, meaning that they should be simultaneously widespread, long-term, and severe. And it's very complicated to demonstrate, and also it's complicated to legally define what it means that these criteria should be cumulatively met. What damage even mean? For instance, the flooding, would it be damage or not? Would be the climate change, the change in the microclimate of the region considered a damage or not? So there are a number of questions that do not have their legal answers right now in the Rome Statute or in international humanitarian law that prevented in the past many organizations and lawyers of bringing cases to the International Criminal Court or the National international courts. In our case, we think that with such a level of legal gymnastics, we can prove that indeed this type of crime has been committed in Kaiowá. But I've just tried to demonstrate you how complicated it still is. And the solution is, of course, the introduction of the crime of ecocide to the Rome Statute, because this introduction of this crime would really streamline the definition of the environmental crimes. It will also help to bring environment into the equation when we speak about such violations of international humanitarian law as, for instance, attacks against civilian objects or destruction of civilian objects. The environment is not in the equation in those types of crimes right now, but ecocide will help to bring it to it. Also, the definition of ecocide is much clearer regarding the impact of the attacks or impact of the acts on the environment. It does not require the simultaneous or cumulative fulfillment of these widespread, long-term, and severe criteria. Because of that, we consider the introduction of ecocide really important right now, and it should be our answer to the atrocities against the environment that are happening around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dmytro. I think that's a really impactful demonstration of the sort of cascading impacts that one act of environmental destruction can have on various aspects of the environment, and also of bringing in the recklessness element into the definition. So turning now to one of our other scenarios, we'd like to discuss the impact that ecocide can have on place, and specifically on our oceans, which, as was touched on in the context of climate change-related harms to small island states, and in other ways are vulnerable to environmental catastrophe. So I'm now turning to Captain Alex remotely to discuss some of the ways that ecocide can impact or has already impacted the ocean and marine wildlife.
Thank you, Ashika. Esteemed co-hosts and participants, thank you for having this event, and thank you for inviting me to this event. I'd like to turn the attention a little bit on my experience when it comes to, and the organization's experience when it comes to environmental crimes on the ocean. I've been involved with the organization I represent for about 20 years, and I've been on fishing vessels where I've seen firsthand the destruction, dead sharks on fishing vessels, other marine life that has been killed by illegal fishing vessels. I'd like to specifically talk about campaigns that we've been doing in Africa for the last 7 years. And as an example, I'd like to take Liberia. Liberia is one of our partner countries. We work together with the Liberian government to help them patrol their waters against illegal fishing activity. We do that using our own vessels and invite the Coast Guard of those countries on board to see what illegal activity takes place in their waters. Now, Liberia, of course, is a country that is one of the poorest countries in the world. Population was severely decimated by 2 civil wars, by an Ebola pandemic. So the country is still recovering from all that. In Liberia, there is a 6-mile exclusion zone for the artisanal fishermen. These are subsistence fishermen who dig out canoes to go out into the waters. They catch fish for their village, for their families. And before we came there about 6-7 years ago, we heard from the local fishermen that the industrial fishing vessels were coming into the exclusion zone, which is strictly reserved for artisanal fishermen. They were fishing at night. They were running over their nets. They were using boiling water to hose the fishermen down, sometimes running over their canoe, risking their lives. Some people died. Now, these exclusion zones are reserved for about 32,000 local fishermen, and they were saying that the fish were simply disappearing. And so when we started these patrols, we encountered indeed a lot of illegal activity. Since we've been doing these patrols over the last 6 years, we've seen that the illegal activity has ceased and that the fish is coming back. Now, just to talk a little bit about the impact of illegal fishing on the ecosystem, I'd like to give an example of one of the vessels that were arrested with the Liberian Coast Guard. But I'd like to go back in time a little bit. Now, in the 90s, there was about 50 boats, mostly Spanish-owned. They were fishing in the Northeast Atlantic, fishing for sharks using deep-sea gill nets, so deep water sharks. In just a couple of years, they decimated the deep-sea shark population. And and they would move on to other parts of the world. They went to Asia, and then they would disappear. 4 years ago, during one of the patrols, the Liberian Coast Guard arrested a vessel called the Vanuatu. This was a vessel that actually has a fishing license to fish for tuna in Liberian waters, so it was an officially licensed vessel using long lines fishing for tuna. Upon inspection, it turned out that the vessel wasn't using long lines, but was using deep-sea gill nets, and that the vessel wasn't targeting tuna, but was targeting sharks. Upon further inspection on board, it turned out that this vessel had a hidden shark liver oil factory on board. And based on the catch documents on board, we found that they were offloading about 40 tons of shark liver oil after each fishing expedition. Now, 40 tons of shark liver oil equates to approximately 53,000 dead sharks every fishing trip. So conservatively, this vessel was killing about 500,000 sharks every single year. So the impact on the deep sea shark population, of course, is enormous. 500,000 sharks. Not only the impact on the deep sea shark population is devastating, but also on all the other species that live in the area. Now, deep sea sharks obviously are predatory species, and if you take one of the predatory species out of the ecosystem, it completely offsets the balance in the ecosystem. So the arrest of this vessel, which hasn't fished for the last 4 years, basically equating to about 2 million sharks that were saved by one single arrest. But this vessel was fined. It was subsequently released. It was later arrested in another country. But the crime should be far, far higher for vessels like this. I mean, having a vessel out there that is actually killing that many species that are so crucial to an ecosystem, there should be a law in place that prevents this from happening and gives us a tool as marine conservation groups and government partners that we work with to actually go after the people that are committing these crimes in a much harder way. I've also worked in the Galapagos Islands for a long time where we had a similar issue. A lot of the fishing vessels that were arrested were simply given a fine and then released. But the crimes are so devastating to the ecosystem, not only to the ecosystem, but also to the small coastal communities, or like in the Galapagos, to the tourism industry. So we need to have a powerful tool to actually address the ecocide. And it would certainly help the work of our government partners all around the world, and also ourselves as an organization. So I really hope that we can get Ecocide as a powerful tool. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Captain Alex. And of course, that sort of environmental damage to our oceans deeply impacts the peoples who live near and depend on those oceans. We've heard a little bit about that from Captain Alex in terms of the Liberian fishermen, and I'd now like to turn to Maureen to speak more on the impact on Pacific Island peoples. Maureen, in your work with the Pacific Network on Globalization, or PANG, how have you seen ecocide and the effects of ecocide impact Pacific peoples, their rights, and their ability to be self-determining?
A very good morning from Suva, Fiji. Thank you and deep gratitude to the permanent missions of Vanuatu and Samoa and the Stop Ecocide Foundation. I wanted to start by qualifying that I am no expert in law. However, my interest lies in the development of legal norms and more specifically the potential application of law to both human and non-human. The Pacific Ocean has long been considered as a zone of sacrifice for global imperatives. Under the narrative of world peace and for the good of all mankind, the testing of over 300 nuclear and thermonuclear weapons by the most powerful nations, the US, Britain, and France, and sanctioned by the United Nations during a period as trust territories, as was the case for the Marshall Islands. Wanton acts of severe, widespread, and long-term damage to the environment and a people whose lives are wholly dependent on a healthy environment. Such acts were permissible for several reasons. The most compelling arguments are, we are just faraway islands, out of sight and out of mind, with extremely small populations. It was also believed that the Pacific Ocean was so vast and empty blue space that it could absorb the destructive power of these nuclear tests. As Henry Kissinger's famous quote about the Marshall Islands, there are only 90,000 people out there. Who gives a damn? Since the first tests in 1946, the people of the Marshall Islands, Christmas Islands in Kiribati, and Maohinui, what many of you today know as French Polynesia, have continued to endure the devastating legacy of nuclear testing. Contaminated islands, blown up reef systems and ecology, internal displacement, devastating cancer rates, and profound changes to culture and society. The most powerful in the world use these islands, people, and ecology as guinea pigs and hid the truth about these tests. Those who sought legal redress under crimes against humanity and environment were charged with treason, as was the case of former President Oscar Temaru of Maohinui. Today, that same kind of contempt for the Pacific Ocean is experiencing another assault with Japan's recent decision to dump over 1.3 million tons of treated radioactive wastewater from Fukushima Daiichi power plant into the Pacific Ocean over a period of 30 to 40 years. Japan argues that technically, by building a pipeline to discharge the radioactive wastewater, this is not constituted as dumping and therefore does not contravene the London Dumping Convention, whilst the IAEA in July permitted it or gave the green light to Japan, claiming that the approach and activities taken by Japan are consistent with international safety standards and that the controlled gradual discharge of treated water to the sea as currently planned and assessed would be negligible, would have very little impact on people and the environment. Which brings me to my final case for a just energy transition, yet another global imperative to win the world of its addiction to fossil fuel, but in doing so, become dependent on minerals to rationalize and justify deep-sea mining with the Pacific Ocean, yet again, its sacrifice zone. Both within national jurisdictions and beyond national jurisdiction, in an area called the Clariton-Clipperton Zone, over 1.7 million square miles between Hawaii and Mexico, an abyssal plain as wide as the United States. It's home to amazing and unique habitats. The abyssal plains, hydrothermal vents and coal seep, considered the origins of our world, seamounts, carbon storage sinks, and deep water column, our collective heritage. Mining the nodules for electric car batteries would involve a process similar to open strip mining of the top layer of the ocean floor, separating the nodules from the mud using a giant tube to pump them to a surface ship and returning the water and fine sediments, which we now know could potentially be radioactive, through another tube. Many marine scientists are today concerned about the potential severe impacts of disturbing the seabed in this manner. Nodules form over millions of years and cannot be replaced in any meaningful way. And scientists are just beginning to study some of the rare species that live at these depths between 5,000 to 6,000 meters below the surface, from sponges and sea anemones to shrimps and octopods, many of which are endemic to site. Little is known about how far they range, how populations are connected, and what irreversible damage may be caused by the spread of radioactive sediment plumes and other effects of mining, including light and sound. Scientific monitoring of the experimental dredge sites in the deep sea sediment has shown that decades after a site is disturbed, few, if any, communities of organisms have recovered. In fact, scientists have gone further to state that recovery would not be possible within human timeframes. In my humble view, deep-sea mining fits the description of ecocide. It is wanton, severe, widespread, and its impact is long-term and intergenerational. I want to end by simply saying this, that for too long, Pacific peoples and our environment have been the blunt end of the law, carrying the disproportionate burden of impacts and, further still, the burden of proof rather than the polluters or those that commit environmental crime. We watch and follow with great interest the developments in Ecocide, as well as giving rights to oceans, to give confidence and in the role of law in addressing and securing justice for the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maureen. I think that's a really clear reminder that even decades-old acts of destruction can have ongoing harms and that there are new imminent harms on the horizon, so much work for a new crime of ecocide to do. Finally, Rodrigo, to turn to you to sort of pull together all these different strands, the definition of ecocide provided by the independent expert panel has been the subject of much discussion since it was first proposed in 2021. Could you break it down for us a bit further? Because I think we have both a variety of lawyers and non-lawyers in the audience. So what would the definition actually require someone to show if they were bringing a claim of ecocide? And could it encompass the various environmental harms we've heard the different panelists speak about today?
So thank you so much. It is a real honor to be here in this wonderful event, sharing the floor with environmental protectors from all over the world. Please, I prepare a presentation, if you can share, yes. So first, please, the next one. I will say next, and you pass. Thank you. Well, this image represents an inflection point in human history. Next, please. This was the starting point. This is a Nuremberg trial. Next, please. The adoption of International Criminal Court is the ending of this process. Next, please. This image belongs to the Vietnam War, the crime of ecocide born around the environmental destruction produced in this armed conflict. Yes, this person is Arthur Galston, a scientist that created the fertilizer that was a precursor to Agent Orange. The army modified some elements of that fertilizer and become into Agent Orange. So after that, Galston became an environmental activist and stand in the US Congress a speech about what happened in Vietnam War and used the word for first time, ecocide. So if you allow me some few seconds to comparison with Albert Einstein, the studies of Albert Einstein was used to create a nuclear bomb. So the studies of Galston was used to create the Agent Orange. So Albert Einstein became a pacifist and Galston became an activist for environment. Next, please. So this is the long evolution. I have no time to refer this evolution. Next, please. But at the end of this evolution, the ecocide was not included in the Rome Statute, just as a war crime in very restrictive way. So next, please. This wonderful lady is Polly Higgins. She rescued the term ecocide and bring it to life, a new life. Next, please. We are, my opinion is that we are in another inflection point in human history because we are living in climate and environmental emergency. Next, please. This is the panel convened by the Stop Ecocide Foundation. Next, please. And here we have the panel again, and in this link, you have the definition with all the commentaries and explanation if you want to follow this exposition. This is the panel again, and you have. I want to refer some few characteristics of this panel. So the panel had gender balance, racial and ethnic inclusion, continental representativeness of legal system, common law and civil law, and so on. Next, please. So this is the general comment about the definition. The definition pretends to be applied by the ICC not by domestic courts. So if you want to apply in domestic legislation, maybe you need to make some changes. It depends on your system, common law or civil law. So the definition intends to adopt an ecocentric or biocentric approach, not an anthropocentric one. It does not pretend to be neither the only, nor the first, nor the best measure to protect the environment, nor does exclude other environmental crimes. It is only intent to be a definition to start the debate in the ICC Assembly of State Parties. Next, please. So this is the definition. Definition has one paragraph and two paragraphs. This is paragraph 1. So ecocide means unlawful or wanton act committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment that be caused by those acts. Next, please. So this is the definition of term. Paragraph 2 is definition of terms. What is environment? Well, this is a scientific definition of environmental, and we add just outer space because the contamination of outer space. Next, please. So the definition includes two types of threshold. They must be rebased to configure the crime in practice. These thresholds are: 1, the first group is related to the damage to the environment, and the second group refers to endangerment action itself. So related to the damage to environment, what is, it needs to be severe, damage needs to be severe, widespread, or long-term. What is severe? Means the damage which involve very serious adverse changes, disruptions, or harm to any element of the environment, including grave impact on human life or natural, cultural, or economic sources. Just please think about those cases that we already hear here in this event. Widespread. What is widespread? Means damage which extends behind limit of geographic area, crosses state boundaries, or it suffers by an entire ecosystem or species or large number of human beings. And finally, long-term. Long-term means damage which is irreversible or which cannot be redressed through natural recovery within a reasonable period of time. Next, please. So the second threshold is about the action. Action must be unlawful or wanton. Unlawful is against the law, could be against international law or national legislation. And wanton means reckless disregard for damage which would be clearly excessive in relation to the social and economic benefit anticipated. Next, please. This is the most funny part of my presentation. This is Pinky and the Brain. I hope you know them. Now, fortunately, there is another villain who night after night is planning to destroy ecosystems. Therefore, dolus or direct intent is not an issue in this crime. So what usually happens, next please, usually happens is like this. It's like this guy. Is desire of companies to obtain economic benefits, and sometimes they carry out risky activities without adopting the necessary measures to prevent potential environmental damage. So that's why the panel agreed to extend the mens rea beyond the existing one by default in Article 30 of the Rome Statute. So the provision refers to the direct intent and second grade of dolus, that mean aware of that circumstances exist or consequences will occur in the ordinary course of the event. So the panel agreed that dolus eventualis is a subjective element because it's necessary to open this link, this subjective links. So, but at the same time, the panel ruled out inferior formulas such as negligence, for example. Next, please. ecocide is an endangerment crime. Ecocide is already, I said, ecocide is defined based on the act or omission and not by the result or the consequences. So, in the case of ecocide, next please, the crime is consumed by the sole fact of committing an action or omission unlawful or wanton, knowing that there is a high probability of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment. So next, please, regarding the cases and the victims that we already hear, just few words. As we can see, this simple and complex definition at the same time, if it will be adopted by the ICC and the states, will protect each case that we hear before in my presentation. Protect the Amazon and the indigenous people because the damage is severe and widespread and long-term. Protect what happened in Ukraine because this definition must be applied in peacetime and either in wartime. Protect the oceans because this international crime will be applied all over the world, even in the oceans that has no under any jurisdiction. And protect the sea level rising because this crime will protect us from the regular ecocide and the global ecocide, including climate change. Those countries are doing a process, next please, sorry. Those countries are doing a process to make ecocide a crime at an internal level and domestic legislations. Final words, please. We propose a new international crime, ecocide, because only by protecting the environment we will have a future to offer to next generation of human beings and other species, animal and plants, who have as much right as we to inhabit on our planet. Let's do it, make it happen, help us to implementing this crime to stop ecocides and protect our planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. I wish I had had you as a professor in law school. I don't think I've ever had a legal standard broken down so clearly and entertainingly as that. So thank you for that. So I apologize. We're actually at time. We had planned to leave some time for additional questions to the panel, but we've run out of time with all these fascinating presentations. I think the panelists, or most of them, will be around. If you'd like to approach us after to ask questions, please feel free to do so. I also wanted to highlight just one important, very recent development. Today, the Coalition for International Criminal Justice has just issued a very powerful statement calling for the ICC Assembly of States Parties to adopt a resolution at its 2024 session to convene a special working group on ecocide. So this may be something that we hope states parties would like to consider as we contemplate next steps to protect our planet and the most vulnerable populations from the urgent threats posed by the destruction of our environment. So there are copies of this statement, also of the independent expert panel definition of ecocide, and some other materials right there at the table by the door. If you'd like to pick up copies on your way out, please feel free to do so. And so with that, I would just like to thank very much our distinguished panel, all the speakers, Jojo or anyone else. I don't know if you have any other closing remarks.
Just to thank everybody for coming and to say that this is a conversation that has been growing year on year for the last several years. And it's very exciting to see how states are beginning to engage with this conversation in a very serious way, and very encouraging to see that there are eminent groups of thinkers also applying their thinking to this and recommending some concrete next steps. So that's very exciting and looking forward to ongoing developments. Thank you.
Thank you very much.